AITA for refusing to help my brother pay off his debt after he tried to publicly shame me. Growing up, I always knew that money was a sensitive topic in my family. My parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet, often juggling bills and living paycheck to paycheck. They weren't bad with money, they just didn't have much of it. Despite our struggles, they always made sure my brother Ryan and I had what we needed. That's probably why they let Ryan slide with so much, even when he made bad decisions. He was the golden boy in their eyes, the older sibling who could do no wrong, even when his actions screamed otherwise. Ryan, now 25, has always had a complicated relationship with money. For as long as I can remember, he's been reckless. He's the kind of person who'd get his paycheck and immediately blow it on something stupid: a new gaming console, fancy clothes, expensive nights out with friends. When I was younger, I didn't fully understand why my parents would get so upset with him, but as I got older, I started to see the pattern. Ryan would spend, and then come crying to my parents when he couldn't pay his bills, and somehow, they always helped him. It didn't matter if it meant cutting back on groceries or skipping a utility payment, they would find a way to bail him out. I've always been the opposite. I'm 19 now, but even as a teenager, I was a saver. I watched my parents struggle and decided early on that I didn't want to live like that. So, when I turned 18 and got my first full-time job, I made a promise to myself. I'd save as much as possible and build a stable financial future. For the past year, I've worked hard, sticking to a strict budget and resisting the urge to splurge on things I didn't need. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. By the time I hit 19, I had saved up a decent chunk of money, enough to feel proud of myself and breathe a little easier about my future. When my family found out about my savings, they were supportive for the most part. My parents were proud of me, saying they admired my discipline and wished they'd had the same mindset when they were younger. But Ryan, not so much. When he heard about my savings, his reaction was different. At first, he made little jokes. "Wow, look at you, rolling in cash now," he said with a grin. "Guess that means you can start helping out the family, huh?" I laughed it off, thinking he was just teasing. But the comments kept coming, and they started to feel less like jokes and more like subtle hints. "Must be nice to have all that money and no real expenses," he'd say. Or, "Don't forget where you came from. Family comes first, you know." I tried to brush it off, but deep down, I knew what was coming. Ryan has never been the type to hold back when it comes to asking for money. He's always had this entitled way of acting, as if his problems are everyone else's responsibility to fix. I'd seen him do it countless times with my parents, sometimes directly, with big, dramatic pleas, and other times more subtly, by dropping hints and letting them piece together that he was in trouble. Over the years, I'd grown used to this pattern, but I never thought I'd be the one he turned to. Sure enough, last week, my phone lit up with an incoming call from Ryan. It wasn't unusual for him to call me, but the moment I heard his voice, I knew something was off. He sounded overly cheerful, almost forced, like he was trying too hard to be nice. "Hey, sis," he began, with way more enthusiasm than usual. "How's it going? You been doing okay?" The way he was buttering me up immediately put me on edge. Ryan isn't exactly the check-in type unless he has an ulterior motive. We exchanged some small talk, but I could feel him steering the conversation towards something specific. He was building up to it, throwing in little comments like, "I'm really glad things are going well for you," and, "You've been working so hard, I'm proud of you." I wanted to believe he was being genuine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had an agenda. Finally, after a few minutes of this, he let out a heavy sigh and said, "So, I need a favor." My stomach dropped. Here it was. I stayed calm and asked, "What kind of favor?" Even though I already had a pretty good idea of where this was going. He paused for a moment, like he was trying to figure out the best way to phrase it, and then he launched into his explanation. He told me he'd racked up about $3,000 in credit card debt and needed to pay it off immediately to avoid serious trouble. He didn't specify what kind of trouble, but I could hear the tension in his voice. "It's really urgent," he added, almost pleading. I asked him how he'd managed to get so far in the hole, even though I already knew the answer. Ryan always had an excuse ready, And this time was no different. I just had a run of bad luck, he said, his tone almost defensive, like he could sense my skepticism. Things have been really tough lately, you know. And it's not like I spent it on dumb stuff or anything. He was trying to frame it like he'd been forced into this situation, but I wasn't buying it. I knew better. Ryan has a gambling problem, something he's never admitted outright but is painfully obvious to everyone in the family. Whether it's sports betting, online poker, or scratch-off tickets, he just can't seem to resist the lure of easy money. On top of that, he's impulsive to a fault. Last year, he spent over $1,000 on a new gaming PC, even though he already had one that worked perfectly fine. When I questioned him about it back then, he brushed it off, saying, "It was on sale, so I actually saved money." That's just how Ryan thinks. Every bad decision is justified in his mind, and every consequence is somehow someone else's problem to solve. When he finished his little speech, he added, "You don't even have any big expenses right now, so it's not like you'd miss the money. It would really help me out, and I'll pay you back as soon as I can." I took a deep breath and told him no. I explained that I'd worked hard for that money and wasn't comfortable lending it to him, especially knowing his history with finances. I said I didn't trust that he'd use it responsibly or pay me back. As soon as the word no left my mouth, Ryan flipped. He went from friendly and polite to angry and defensive in seconds. "Wow, so you're just gonna let me sink?" he snapped. "You're supposed to help family. Do you even care about what happens to me? Or are you just too selfish to share?" I tried to stay calm, but his words hit a nerve. It wasn't just the frustration of being called selfish or greedy, it was the way he said it, like it was a foregone conclusion that I was the villain in this scenario simply because I'd set a boundary. I reminded him, as evenly as I could, that I wasn't responsible for his financial mistakes and that he needed to take accountability for his actions. "Ryan," I said, trying to stay steady despite the lump forming in my throat, "this isn't about me not caring. It's about you learning to handle your own problems without relying on someone else to clean up the mess." But he didn't want to hear it. Every word I said seemed to make him angrier, as though I was attacking him instead of defending myself. His voice rose with each response, growing more hostile and accusatory. "Selfish. That's what you are. You're greedy, sitting on all that money and refusing to help your own brother." He was practically shouting by then, his words cutting into me like knives. "I'm your brother," he spat, his tone dripping with resentment. "How can you just turn your back on me like this? Don't you care about family, or is your precious money more important than blood?" I sat there clutching the phone, feeling my frustration boil over into anger, but also something deeper hurt. Hurt because he wasn't just asking for help. He was demanding it, as if I owed him, as if my hard work meant nothing and he had some unspoken claim to what I'd earned. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how unfair it was for him to put me in this position, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. Ryan wasn't interested in understanding my side. He just wanted what he wanted, and he decided I was the obstacle in his way. Eventually, he hung up on me mid-sentence, leaving me staring at the screen, stunned and emotionally drained. The silence that followed felt deafening, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I replayed the conversation in my head, trying to figure out if I could have handled it differently, but the truth was, no matter what I said, Ryan wouldn't have accepted anything short of a yes. The worst part wasn't even the yelling or the guilt-tripping, it was the feeling that, to him, I was nothing more than a bank account with legs. I thought that would be the end of it, but I should have known better. Ryan isn't the type to let things go quietly. A few days later, as I scrolled through my social media feed, I saw a post that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a long, angry rant on Ryan's page, and while he didn't name me directly, it was painfully obvious who he was talking about. "Imagine having a sibling who's hoarding money while their own family struggles," he wrote. "Some people forget their roots as soon as they get a little success. It's disgusting." The words felt like a slap in the face, not because they were true, they weren't, but because of how deliberately he was trying to turn people against me. The comments were even worse. People who didn't know the full story, or any of the story for that matter, were chiming in with their 2 cents, completely buying into his narrative. "Wow, that's cold," one person wrote. "Family is supposed to help each other, Another commented, "Money changes people, I guess." Sad to see, every new notification felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into the wound. Each comment seemed to validate Ryan's version of events while painting me as the heartless, greedy sister who'd abandoned her family. What infuriated me the most wasn't just that Ryan had twisted the story, it was the fact that he'd made our private conflict so public. Instead of having a mature conversation or even just stewing in his anger privately, he'd decided to air our dirty laundry for the world to see, framing himself as the victim and me as the villain. It was cruel, manipulative, and completely unfair, and now, thanks to his post, I was being dragged through the mud by people who didn't even know me. To make matters worse, some family members started reaching out to me, asking why I wouldn't help Ryan. My aunt called me, saying, "You know, Ryan's made mistakes, but he's still your brother. Can't you just help him out this one time?" A cousin messaged me, saying, "It's just money. You'll make more, but family is forever." Even my mom got involved, calling me to ask if I could just lend him the money to keep the peace. She admitted she didn't agree with how Ryan was handling things but said she didn't want the family to fight over it. I felt cornered. On one hand, I hated the idea of giving Ryan money he didn't deserve, especially when he'd done nothing to prove he could handle it responsibly. On the other hand, the pressure from my family was overwhelming. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that giving in wouldn't solve anything. Ryan has been bailed out so many times, and it's never taught him a lesson. If anything, it's made him worse. Why should I sacrifice my hard-earned savings to enable his bad habits? I stood my ground. I told my mom and everyone else who asked that I wasn't going to give Ryan the money. It wasn't an easy thing to do, especially with the weight of their disappointment hanging in the air every time the topic came up. But I knew deep down that this wasn't about being selfish or heartless, it was about setting boundaries that I should have set a long time ago. If I give him $3,000 now, I explained over and over, what's to stop him from coming back in a few months asking for more? And then what? Do I just keep handing over money every time he gets himself into a mess? My voice would shake sometimes when I said it, not because I wasn't sure, but because I was exhausted from defending myself against a barrage of guilt and misplaced loyalty. I tried to make them understand that this wasn't about the money itself. It wasn't like I couldn't technically afford to give him $3,000, it was the principle. Ryan had spent years running away from his responsibilities, knowing full well that someone would always be there to catch him when he fell. If it wasn't my parents, it was a friend or another family member. Now, it was supposed to be me, but I couldn't let that happen. I'd worked too hard for what I had, not just in terms of saving money but in creating a sense of independence and stability for myself. If I gave in to Ryan now, I'd be undoing all of that. And worse, I'd be enabling him to continue down the same destructive path. But Ryan didn't see it that way. In his mind, I wasn't just refusing to help him, I was betraying him. He sent me a string of angry texts that only solidified my decision to say no. The messages came in rapid succession, each one more venomous than the last. "You're a terrible sister," one of them read. "I hope you're happy knowing you're letting me drown while you sit on a pile of money doing nothing." Another one said, "I don't know how you can sleep at night, being this selfish. Family is supposed to help each other, but clearly, you don't care about anyone but yourself." As I read through the texts, I felt a mixture of anger and sadness bubbling up inside me. On one hand, I wanted to lash out, to defend myself against his accusations and tell him exactly what I thought of his entitlement. On the other hand, I felt an overwhelming sense of disappointment not just in him but in the situation as a whole. How had it come to this? How had Ryan become someone who thought it was acceptable to insult and berate me just because I wouldn't give him what he wanted? The final message he sent was the most dramatic of them all. "If you can't even be there for me when I need you the most, then I don't need you in my life at all. Don't bother calling or texting me. We're done." I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the words sink in. For a split second, I felt a pang of guilt, like maybe I really was being too harsh. But then I thought about everything that had led up to this moment, all the times Ryan had taken advantage of our parents, all the excuses, all the promises to do better that he'd never followed through on, and I felt a strange sense of relief. The idea of Ryan cutting me off honestly made me laugh. Not in a malicious way, but because it was so absurd. It wasn't like our relationship had been in a great place to begin with. We talked occasionally, mostly out of obligation, but there was always this underlying tension between us. He resented me for being the responsible one, and I resented him for constantly putting his problems onto everyone else. If cutting me off meant I wouldn't have to deal with his guilt trips and manipulative tactics anymore, then so be it. Maybe it was for the best. As for the rest of the family, opinions are split. Some people think I did the right thing by refusing to enable him, while others think I'm being too harsh. But at the end of the day, I know I made the right choice. I've worked too hard to let someone guilt trip me into giving up what I've earned, especially when they've done nothing to deserve it. So, am I the asshole? Honestly, I don't think so. But Ryan and his supporters would probably say otherwise. Update. A few days after Ryan's angry outburst and his string of venomous texts, I started to feel like the worst of it was behind me. I was still upset, of course. Being painted as the villain by my own brother wasn't something I could just shake off. But I felt a strange kind of resolve. For the first time in a long time, I'd stood my ground against Ryan's manipulative behavior, and I was proud of myself for that. I thought I'd finally closed the chapter on this mess. I was wrong. It was late in the afternoon when my mom called. She rarely called me during the day, so I picked up immediately, thinking it might be something important. Her voice was calm but had an edge to it, like she was trying to keep the conversation casual while gearing up to say something she knew I wouldn't like. She started with a few pleasantries: how was work, had I eaten, the usual small talk. But there was an unmistakable tension in her tone, and I could feel the weight of what was coming. Finally, after a few minutes, she got to the point. She told me that she and my dad had spoken to Ryan about his debt and that he had broken down, claiming he was at his wit's end. According to her, he seemed genuinely desperate, remorseful even. He had told them he couldn't manage on his own and that he was terrified of what might happen if he couldn't pay off his credit card balance. My mom explained that, after much discussion, she and my dad had decided they would give Ryan $1,500, half of the $3,000 he needed. She paused for a moment, then added, almost hesitantly, that they thought it was only fair if I gave him the other half. I was floored. It wasn't just the suggestion that I should give Ryan money, it was the expectation. My mom spoke about it as if it were a foregone conclusion, as if my contribution to Ryan's bailout was as natural as breathing. The idea that they'd even consider putting this burden on me, after I'd already stood my ground and made my position clear, made me feel completely blindsided. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I took a deep breath and tried to process what she was saying. She told me they couldn't manage the full amount themselves, but they also couldn't bear to see Ryan struggle like this. He was family, she said, and family helps each other. That's just what you do. She emphasized how much this would mean to Ryan, how it could give him a fresh start, and how it would be just this once. The words were familiar. I'd heard them before, countless times, whenever Ryan had screwed up and needed a lifeline. I couldn't help but feel a wave of frustration and disbelief. Hadn't we been through this before? Hadn't Ryan already been given countless fresh starts? I told my mom exactly that, how I was certain that if I gave him this money, it wouldn't be the end of it. Ryan would take the $3,000, spend it carelessly, and find himself in an even bigger mess a few months down the line. He wouldn't learn anything. He never did. My mom listened quietly but countered with the same argument. Family is family, and sometimes you have to do things you don't want to do for the people you love. She assured me that this time was different, that Ryan had promised to change, that he was really scared and wanted to do better. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt like she was reading from a script that Ryan had written himself. For a moment, I thought about saying no again, about holding my ground like I had the last time, but the guilt started to creep in. My mom wasn't yelling or accusing me like Ryan had, she was pleading. And as much as I hated it, a part of me felt like I was being unreasonable. She and my dad were willing to give up their own money, even though they didn't have much to spare. How could I say no when they were willing to make that kind of sacrifice? Still, I wasn't going to cave completely. I told her that if I gave Ryan the money, there would have to be conditions. I wasn't just going to hand over $1,500 and trust that he'd magically change his ways. I wanted assurances that the money would go directly to paying off his debt and nothing else. I said I wanted proof, receipts, statements, something tangible to show that the money was being used for the right purpose. My mom hesitated but eventually agreed, saying she would talk to Ryan and make sure he understood. The decision didn't sit well with me, even as I made it. It felt like I was going against everything I believed in, everything I'd been trying to stand up for. But the pressure from my family was overwhelming, and I just wanted the whole situation to be over. Part of me hoped that by setting conditions, I could at least salvage a bit of control and ensure that the money wouldn't be wasted. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a mistake. That night, I transferred the $1,500 into my mom's account, asking her to handle the transaction so I wouldn't have to deal with Ryan directly. It felt like handing over a piece of myself, a piece I'd worked so hard to protect. I couldn't stop thinking about all the hours I'd spent earning that money, all the sacrifices I'd made to save it, only for it to end up in the hands of someone who had never appreciated anything he'd been given. As I lay in bed that night, I tried to convince myself that I'd done the right thing, that this would help Ryan get back on track, that maybe this time really would be different. But in the pit of my stomach, I couldn't ignore the nagging doubt, the fear that I'd just set a precedent I couldn't undo. And as much as I tried to push it aside, one thought kept running through my mind. What happens when he asks for more? I hope he becomes smarter.